This is the beginning of the worksheet called Cell Physiology. And I made a mistake and forgot to put eukaryotes and prokaryotes on this worksheet. So in class, either at the top of the page or the bottom of the page or on a separate page, we added these brief notes on the difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. And so let's first of all understand that all living things, like if you take everything in the universe and we look at just those things that are made of cells, that eat and breathe and grow and respond and all those cool things that living things do, that all those things that are made of cells can be broken down into two types of cells. And we do that by looking to see whether or not the DNA is inside of a nuclear membrane. Cells are really, really old. The very earliest life forms on Earth were cells, just cells. They didn't have large structures and systems and organs and tissues. They were just cells. In fact, they were bacteria. Their structure, because they're so old, is a little bit different than the cells that we have today. Cells have evolved over time and developed different characteristics. And so, and it's actually this characteristic of having DNA inside of a membrane that makes that first distinction in all living things. So we say either the DNA is in a nucleus, or DNA is not in a nucleus. And it's not that there isn't new DNA, there is DNA, it's just not contained. If it's not contained, then we call that a prokaryote. And we learned the word pro means first or before, and karyote means like a kernel or nut. And so this would be the very earliest nucleus, or the very first kind of a cell type. And there's only one organism that has this, and that is bacteria. So bacteria are organisms. They're living things. They oftentimes ciliated and have little hair-like projections and little tails, and they are able to move around. And they have DNA, but that DNA is not contained in a membrane. It's just kind of hanging out in the cytoplasm. The other way of being a cell where DNA is in a nucleus, we call organisms that have this particular plan in their cells, body plan, we call them a eukaryote, or a complete nucleus. All living things can be sorted into 5 kingdoms. And bacteria are one of those kingdoms. The other 4 kingdoms are plants, animals, fungi, and protists. We are animals because we have a nucleus in our cells. So we draw out our nucleus, our cell. Here's our nucleus, and the DNA is inside of the nucleus. Or bacteria have DNA, but they don't have it in a nucleus. Everything except bacteria is a eukaryote. Plants are eukaryotes, animals are eukaryotes, fungi are eukaryotes. All of these guys are all multicellular. And these are all one-celled creatures. Well, most of them are one-celled, and sometimes they are plant-like, which means that they can photosynthesize. Sometimes they're animal-like, which means that they have to eat, or they can move around, and fungus-like protists. These are usually one-celled. Plants, one-celled animals, one-celled fungus. So this would be like algae, for example. This would be like an amoeba. And this would be like yeast. Those are all one-celled protists, and they're not bacteria because they have a nuclear membrane around their DNA. And so that's what makes the difference. Okay, let's do our photosynthesis section. Let's start off by drawing the sun. And we'll have that shining down on the little plant. When we dissected plants, we understand they have roots and stems and leaves. And the water for photosynthesis goes in through the roots. And the carbon dioxide that we need for photosynthesis goes in through the leaves. And the light energy that is needed for photosynthesis strikes the leaves and hits a molecule called chlorophyll. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what's going on inside of those plant cells and where photosynthesis actually occurs inside of a plant cell. Photosynthesis occurs in the organelle we call a chloroplast. And let's go ahead and we'll make it green. So here's a plant cell. Nucleus of DNA because it's a eukaryote. A large water vacuole, and then we have all these green things. Those are chloroplasts. And that's where photosynthesis occurs. So when we look inside a chloroplast, or what happens is that water comes in to the cell through osmosis, and CO2 diffuses in through the cell membrane, and they make their way, both of them, to the chloroplast. And in the chloroplast, there are structures that can take light energy, so there has to be light here as well. And it takes the carbon dioxide, actually first it rips apart the water and uses that energy to create an electrical current. And that current, or that falling from energy state to energy state, takes a bunch of carbon dioxide molecules and sticks them together to make sugar. And sugar is a very big molecule, and specifically the sugar that we talk about when we talk about photosynthesis is a molecule called glucose. We understand that all carbohydrates are sugars, and all sugars end in that ending OSE. We talked about that before. And glucose is a 6-carbon ring, a hexane ring. Yep. And where it has carbons and hydrogens and oxygens on every corner. Now, if any of your parents or chemistry professors, don't get mad at me about how I'm drawing this hexane ring, but we're just trying to make a point. The point is that this is a very big molecule. This is sugar. And all of those little bonds and attachments of all those elements of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen is where the energy is found in sugar. And once, and then the oxygen that is needed to make that, once that's done, once the sugar is made, it releases also oxygen gas. So the oxygens that came from breaking water just kind of get sent out and become a gas. So we get sugar plus oxygen as the result of photosynthesis. And this is how plants make food for themselves. An important thing to understand is that plants don't make sugar and oxygen for you. They make it for themselves because they need it. They need it to build their cell structure. Okay, in fact, let's write that down. Plants do this for themselves. Not for us. They use the sugar, is used by the plant to make all its parts, including and especially its cell wall, which is completely made out of cellulose, which is just a bunch of hexamines stuck together. Okay, so that's photosynthesis. And that is the function of the chloroplast, is to make food and oxygen for the plant. Okay, cellular respiration is what happens after photosynthesis occurs in plant cells and in animal cells. And what happens is that the sugar, let's say if we're in a plant cell, we get sugar plus oxygen, and it goes from the chloroplast to our mitochondria. In a plant. So it doesn't ever have to leave the cell, it just goes straight from the chloroplast to the mitochondria. And there, the mitochondria, which looks like this, it's inside of those little tissue folds where cellular respiration occurs. It takes sugar and oxygen, and it starts pulling that huge molecule apart. And as it pulls that molecule apart, every time it does that, it takes some of those carbons and that oxygen and starts turning it into carbon dioxide and water. The reason why it does that is because it needs energy. By breaking those bonds apart, it gives them an opportunity to make a new energetic molecule called ATP. So it takes out water and carbon dioxide as a byproduct, but the purpose of it is to make energy. So where photosynthesis took light energy in and was endothermic, this is a process that is exothermic, where energy is coming out of this process. And we call that energy the molecule ATP. And next year we'll talk more about how ATP works as energy, money in a cell. But that is the purpose of the mitochondria, is to take sugar and oxygen and turn that into energy, and then these are waste products. But notice that these can go to photosynthesis and be used again to produce sugar again, as long as you have a plant that has a chloroplast that can take water and carbon dioxide and use light to make sugar and oxygen again. So this can be cycled, and I'll focus on that a lot next year as well. Now let's say that you're a human being, or animals of any kind. Okay, anything that is not a plant or another autotroph. What we do is we eat and we breathe, and we take the food, the sugar from what we eat, and the oxygen from the air that we breathe, and we send that to our mitochondria. And first of all, that sugar has to get passed through the cell membrane, and we'll talk next about how that works, but just notice that that's a really big deal. That molecule is really big, a lot bigger than oxygen or water, and so it's going to take some extra work to be able to get it into the cell membrane. But once it does get in, it goes to the mitochondria, and the same thing happens. The glucose molecule is pulled apart in the presence of oxygen, giving us ATP energy, and releases water and carbon dioxide as waste products. I think that's all you need to know. But do know also that this can also be breathed out. It can also make its way out in the atmosphere and find its way to a plant. This is an exothermic process because energy comes out. The last one was endothermic. I forgot to tell you that because light goes into this reaction.